bonds, one of those topics, one of those topics that I wanted to talk about here. Um, there's just, I don't know, it's just hard to understand the whole dynamic of the thing, especially now that you would read stuff. I don't know if they're true or not, but there are concerns that are rising that bonds might be the new bank securities with the government's unfunded liabilities. That's also a term that you see a lot. They're hitting new all-time highs or whatever. They're very high, and somehow they all seem to be working together. So yeah, let's maybe start there. Are bonds the most important thing in the financial system to watch right now?
Yeah, they usually are. That's a good place to start. And I know, again, if you're coming at this from a very new perspective, it's sort of difficult. And then the mainstream interpretation of what bonds are signaling is also usually very wrong. I mean, we start from the perspective of interest rates, right? And interest rates are supposed to be really simple. If interest rates go up, that means that means money's being tight. It means all sorts of, the Federal Reserve policy, as we see today, central bank policy in Europe, everywhere else. So interest rates going up must be a bad thing, and interest rates going down must be a good thing. When history shows it's usually the opposite. When interest rates go down and stay down for a prolonged period of time, that usually means money has been tight and the economy is not performing very well. So it can't be stimulus because nothing is being stimulated. Conversely, when we see periods where inflation is just absolutely out of control, nominal growth through the roof, interest rates tend to be very high, not because central banks set them that way, but because the marketplace can find all sorts of nominal opportunities that you don't want to own safe and liquid instruments. So even our basic understanding, or what we're taught about the basics of bond market and interest rates, is wrong from the very start. So again, it's easy. Everybody says this, and this is the way everybody interprets it, but the financial markets work very differently. So it's understandable why people would have a difficulty in interpreting signals, which really are fundamental to the entire global monetary, financial, and economic system.
Well, here is something that I did learn in college, because it wasn't a complete waste of time for me. At least it wasn't a waste of money, because I'm in Europe, so I got pretty much paid to go to college, so I can't really complain there. What I sort of learned is that when bond yields go up, the demand for the currency in which those bonds are denominated goes up as well, because the yields are attractive, and so vice versa. When the yields are low, demand goes down. And I also came to found an interesting conclusion. Didn't come to it myself, obviously, but I found an interesting conclusion that the country that puts off QE the longest is the country that will end up with strongest currencies, or the currency that will start declining last. Does that make any sense there?
It kind of does, but for very different reasons. Usually, if central bank is undertaking QE, it's because the system is in trouble. And the central bank isn't printing money; they don't know what else to do, so they essentially do what everybody else in the central banking community tells them to do. So if a central bank is holding off on QE, it means it's not experiencing the same amount of trouble as maybe its neighbors do. So its currency doesn't get into the same type of issues that its neighbors have. But once it finally goes into QE, the issue isn't QE, it's the reason why the central bank feels it's necessary to do a QE. And so if something's going wrong to the degree that central banks feel that they need to do QE, that's going to be reflected in the currency as well as everything else. So it's not necessarily about QE, or QE doesn't determine the direction of currency or the economy. QE is a response to what's going on that we do need to care about. It's no different in the Fed, the ECB, Bank of Japan, or anywhere else. If a central bank is doing QE, don't pay attention to the QE, pay attention to why the central bank is doing the QE. And that will then start to fill out the rest of the picture.
So it's sort of like something that just happens simultaneously with the currency going. It's somewhat of an intervention to the currency already being destroyed. Is that it?
It's sort of a correlation. It's not a causation, it's a correlation. It's a correlation because the central bank policies are reactive. They're not proactive, they're always reactive. So something bad happens, and what happens? That if it's a currency attached to the US dollar, which is pretty much everybody, then you start to see the currency drop, and you start to see central banks respond to the thing that made the currency drop. And if those two things happen relatively in the same time period, it looks like a correlation. It is a correlation, but some people interpret it as causation.
All right.
That has happened repeatedly. People mistake this correlation for causation when in fact central banks are reacting to the thing that you really need to pay attention to. But we focus on central banks because of course we do. It's in the media, it's in the news, it's in everything that we're taught. And so, I mean, you see the Fed's balance sheet go up, you see the ECB's balance sheet swell, and you think that must be the cause of everything we're seeing, especially when it seems consistent when currencies are dropping. But that's just simple correlation. And again, central bank policies are reactive, which means they're reacting to something that has happened that has caused both the central bank policy as well as the consequences in the economic, financial, and monetary system.
What do you think the central bank, in the face of the Fed, obviously in the US, what do you think they're worried about right now? Is it a currency? Are they thinking about how to save it? Do they care about the economy as a whole? Do they, I don't care about the stock market or the housing market? And I'm just guessing at this point, but what do you think they care about right now?
Yeah, I think they care about phone calls from the White House. I think the Fed is under enormous political pressure to appear to be doing something about consumer prices that by its own standards and its own admission, it can't have any rate hikes are not going to solve consumer prices. The economy is already doing that. But the Fed, like the ECB, has enormous political pressures to try to, I mean, in the US, we have an election coming up in less than a month. And so enormous political pressure to appear to be doing something substantial about what is the number one issue for most voters in the US. I assume it's probably even more of an issue for voters in Europe and other places around the world. So the Fed is simply reacting to the political optics of CPIs going at, stubborn CPIs that stick around 40-year highs are no good. I mean, people hear that all the time. They can feel it, whatever else. So what is the Fed going to do about it, though? I mean, what are rate hikes going to do about getting more oil out of the ground or, getting shipping, especially railroads in the United States, untangling some of these logistical supply chains? They're not. I mean, there's never been a realistic situation. I like what Christine Lagarde said earlier this year when someone asked her about the same thing. Are you going to follow the Fed's path? And she said, hell no. Why would we? We're not going to get more oil out of the ground with rate hikes. And of course, she turned around 180 degrees in the opposite direction a few months later. Why? Not because consumer prices or inflation's out of control, but because she's being politically pressured by governments all over Europe. So what central banks are doing, they're doing it for non-economic reasons. They're not doing it because this is an out of control inflation. They're doing it because CPIs are high and they don't know what else to do. They don't know how to solve what is a non-economic problem. They can't solve what is a non-economic problem.
Yeah, and it's also sort of, at least that's how we did a field trip one day with college where you go to a money museum and then you get to control the lever of when the economy is slowing down, you get to raise interest rates or lower interest rates. And I think there was only one lever there, and that's pretty much the only thing you could do. And then you always mess it up. That was the point, to show you that you're not really smarter than the central bank. And so, you raise the rates too much, and then everybody's out of job and stuff like that. So that was also
but see that Turner, that's part of the myth and the legend. We believe that directions in the economy are influenced, or if not controlled, by central banks. And that's just the myth that's been constructed ever since Paul Volcker in the United States, going back 40 years. When the truth is, interest rates don't work that way, and central banks don't have that level of control and influence. Why are consumer prices so out of control, or at least appear to be so out of control? I mean, in Europe, you know exactly why. Yeah. You have the politics of oil and energy. It has nothing to do with money printing. It has nothing to do with economy. It's the fact that supply and demand are in such a massive mismatch that prices can only be high. That's the only way to adjust that very simple economic imbalance. And it's true about not just oil and energy, but food and all sorts of other goods too. More broadly speaking, around the world, you had the recovery the rebound from the COVID recession in 2020. Demand came back much faster than supply could service it. Again, simple economics. When demand rate rises or rebounds faster than supply, the only way to adjust is through prices. That had nothing to do with money printing. It wasn't even really economic. It's all about, shipping. It's all about pandemic policies, snags in the labor market, shortages, all sorts of non-economic issues that rate hikes are not going to influence, rate hikes are not going to solve. And so we have this mismatch where central banks are doing things that are counterproductive at best, and probably more likely irrelevant than not.
Could we make the case for stagflation though? Because if interest rates are going up, and they cause more unemployment, but the problem with inflation is already in the supply chain. If you have staff shortages, you're going to have more supply chain issues, which might cause the prices to go up even more. And then what you have is lower economic growth, but then higher prices. Is that a possibility?
No, I don't think so, because what ends up happening is the classic supply shock case, which the downside is simply when you get into the demand destruction component, which I think we've been in pretty much all year, that takes care of the high prices. So in essence, you have demand shift to the right, which means demand goes up far more than supply is able to service. It causes essentially a massive redistribution in the economy that the economy cannot afford. I mean, we can't afford gasoline and food prices where they are and where they're going to be, which means that you're essentially robbing from the more vital parts of the economy to pay for non-productive uses like higher gasoline and higher food, which eventually destroys demand in the more productive parts. And so demand starts to come back down for the same level of supply, which means prices normalize anyway. So you don't get stuck into this feedback loop. There is no secular inflation.
From October 9th through 12th, I'm bringing together a group of roughly 40 serious investors and financial professionals, along with some special guests and friends like Hugh Hendry and Mike Green, George Gammon, Brent Johnson, and a couple of other ones, where we're going to spend 4 days asking the questions that truly matter. What happens next? Where are the biggest risks being mispriced? Where are the opportunities? What should change our minds? And how should we think about positioning around it? This is not a conference built around speeches. It's a small room built around discussion, some disagreement, and actionable advice. So if you manage some meaningful capital or you're seriously interested in all of these questions and finding answers to them in a very small, intimate setting, apply below.